I speak this evening on land stolen from the Wongal clan. That's Sydney, Australia, which bore the brunt of the British invasion in 1788. And I acknowledge that this was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. I have been doing some work for WHRC. I'm the only person who uses that acronym, the Women's Human Rights Campaign, which, as people at this seminar probably know, is based on the Declaration of Women's Sex-Based Human Rights. Specifically, what I've been delving in recently is the upcoming Australian census. We are going to have a census on the 10th of August this year. Now, the Declaration stresses the importance of the collection of sex disaggregated data. The points made in the Declaration are: when data is not disaggregated by sex, it is more difficult to identify real and potential inequalities between men and women. The conflation of sex and gender identity is leading to the recording of inaccurate and misleading data used when planning for laws, policies, and actions relating to stuff like employment, political participation, and maybe most crucially, violence against women. So how does the Australian census stack up in terms of reliability of data collection? So this is what I've found out in my delvings. Question 7 is to look like this. So it gives 3 options: male, female, non-binary sex, which is an odd term, actually. I did a bit of a Google on non-binary sex. It really is not a particularly, it's not particularly used as a term anywhere. Go to this link for more information. However, when you go to that link, it doesn't tell you anything. So this is the first time that the census has had non-binary sex as an option in it. They did a bit of experimenting with having a third option in the 2016 census, and I could tell you more about that if you're interested. But for the moment, this is a new thing. So there's at present no information about answering question 7 on the Australian Bureau of Statistics website. As WHRC Australia, we have sent a letter to the Australian Bureau of Statistics and asked what that information for question 7 is to say, and we have sought assurance that the information to be given will be in accordance with the definition of sex as the physical and biological characteristics that distinguish males from females. We've received a holding reply, but we haven't received a substantive reply as yet. In that letter, we've outlined the Declaration's objections to the concept of gender identity and urged them to continue to exclude this regressive concept from the census. And we've also asked that the Australian Bureau of Statistics include us as WHRC in their list of stakeholders for consultation about the next census. The next census after this one this year will be held in 2026, and consultations will begin in 2023. For this census, they had, years of preparation and years of trying out different options. They had 8 possible new topics, and only 3 got through, and one of them was the inclusion of the third option in what they still call the sex question, although, as you can see, it doesn't actually have a heading of sex. Well, just restricting my comments here to statistics, if men who say they're women are included as women in stats, we've got no way of measuring, for example, how many women are put forward as candidates by political parties in winnable seats, or how many women commit sexual assaults, or, well, any number of things. So what to do? Well, I'll be saying much the same as Jack just said, of course, but we need to insist on common definitions of sex, female and male across all data collecting entities in this wide brown land. As the UK group Fair Play for Women rightly says, it is only through the shared meaning of words that data collection and interpretation can have any value whatsoever. In the chat, I have put a link to the website of Fair Play for Women. They've done a hell of a lot of work on data collection. They recently took the, I think it's called the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, to court over the UK census, and they won. You know, so there's a lot of stuff there, specifically on the issue of data collection. And we need, of course, to insist on distinct definitions for sex and gender and end the conflation and ambiguity that's enshrined, positively enshrined, in the Australian government guidelines on the recognition of sex and gender, a really hopeless and pernicious document. And we need to insist, of course, on definitions of woman, man, female and male that are physical and biological. And we need to insist that sex means sex observed and registered at birth. And I would add that we need to denounce gender as a bunch of sex stereotypes that have long been known to be harmful to women. We are an oppressed people, and gender is a major instrument of our oppression because it says that women are innately docile, submissive, passive, deferential, unassertive, given to washing dishes, mopping, sweeping and tidying up. We don't have a gender identity, right? That is buried in the Australian Bureau of Statistics websites. There's a lot of things which seem to indicate that they're moving towards the idea that everybody has a gender identity. Well, we don't have a gender identity. Women are not a gender identity. We aren't cis women or cisgender. We don't collude in our own oppression. We should oppose the normalisation of the term cis and the idea that everybody has a gender identity. Now, how do we do this resistance, this insistence, this denunciation, this opposition? Well, I wish I knew, you know. It has to be collective. We've got to get together in groups and act as groups. And we can mount our resistance at any number of points because there are so many of them. The Australian Bureau of Statistics, for example, has recently said in response to you know, a request made by somebody, I don't think she's here tonight, but anyway, one of the activists here put in a request for the Australian Bureau of Statistics on their data of how many violent offenders are transsexual or transgender. But the Australian Bureau of Statistics replied that because its data are sourced from police administrative systems and police administrative systems don't include that information, they don't have any information to give her. So we could mount a campaign aimed at the police to insist that the police record that. And or we put pressure on the Australian Bureau of Statistics to intervene with the police to ensure that they do record that. And or we call for the repeal of the Australian government guidelines on the recognition of sex and gender. So I just think that somewhere, somehow, something's got to give.
Thanks. Sorry, I didn't mean to send that message about the time to the whole attendees.
That's all right. Okay, that's all right. But basically, that's what occurs to me is exactly how it plays out in bodies, in women's bodies. You know, just as I talked to my own years ago. It plays out in women's bodies, and you see it in the Solomon Islands, where it's absolutely horrific. how women's bodies are used.
Menstrual huts in Nepal is another one that springs to mind.
It's right, but it's just the fact that women give birth on their own in Solomon Islands, many places. It's terrible, really. And in fact, if that is not an infringement of the law, I don't believe Solomon Islands is signatory to it. But in fact, that's what I'm talking about when I think about how this applies. Yeah.
Okay, well, on to our final question. Back to Jack again. What are your suggestions for future directions for attendees and for the Women's Human Rights Campaign as a group?
Gee, I was really hoping to hear more from the people who are participating at this point, because I sort of feel like I've made suggestions in how to move forward, making some analogies between violence against women on an individual level and what's happening on a major level. I think that your ideas about actually talking about each of the sections of the Sex Rights Declaration, doing a chapter at a time, is a really good way of actually, I guess, giving us more information for each of those sections. That's pretty much all I've got to say. Yeah,
and we will be letting everyone into the room in a moment, but I'll just give each of the speakers one more go. So Eileen, you're next. Did you have any closing words, or what are your suggestions for future directions for attendees?
Yeah, I think we can't leave opposition to the trans juggernaut to conservatives. We've got to act collectively and publicly as declarationists. That's another word I've termed, meaning signatories to the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. How does our approach, that is the approach in the Declaration, differ from the conservatives? Well, there are several ways, but just to concentrate on Article 1 and its concern for basic concepts and language, well, we voice our opposition to sex stereotypes. Conservatives often conflate sex and gender just as solidly as trans extremists. I'm trying to get my fingers up on screen, saying sex and gender kind of stuck together. Conservatives think they're stuck together, and so do trans extremists. It's something they have in common. And conservatives, for example, will bridle at, for example, a man wearing eyeliner or a floral shirt or even long hair. I think we distinguish, and the Declaration distinguish itself from such an approach. Secondly, we maintain, support and use the vocabulary reforms of second wave feminism. For example, Ms. The word Ms didn't exist. It was invented in the 70s. Firefighter instead of fireman, police officer instead of policeman. Conservatives often bridle at such changes and kind of whinge about them and say it's politically, I mean, the term politically correct was pretty much invented by conservatives to cover just that kind of thing. And so I think we should make clear that we're not opposed to vocabulary changes per se, just to misogynist vocabulary changes like cis and uterus haver, the dreaded uterus haver, and pregnant person. And that we don't object to saying parent rather than mother in situations that apply or ought to apply to both sexes equally, such as packing a kid's school lunch or changing a baby's nappy. You know, if it's a thing saying, you know, that could say in old time terms, you know, ask your mother to put an apple in your lunchbox. I don't see why we would object. In fact, I don't think we should object if they change that mother to either, you know, growing up in your household or parent or something like that, because we are against sex role stereotyping, and that differentiates us from conservatives. Which is not to say that we can't work with conservatives and applaud them when they do something for women's sex-based rights, etc. Our relationship to conservatives might be a discussion for another time. But I'll just say now that any alliance is stronger if the parties to it are strong in themselves. And my hope is that we as declarationists can become strong in ourselves.